In the oldest stories, the gods do not always arrive like monarchs. They do not always sit upon thrones, laying down laws with a heavy hand. Ancient sources describe figures who pass through the world with a lighter touch, a presence at the edge of the firelight, a voice heard once and then never again. Some interpretations suggest that what made them gods was never dominion, but distance. They did not rule humanity so much as they regarded it. They watched, they taught briefly, and then, with a kind of quiet finality, they withdrew. This pattern is easy to overlook because later generations often prefer their heavens crowded with rulers. We place crowns on the heads of memories. We turn visitors into kings and teachers into creators. Yet when the oldest fragments are held up to the light, the divine often seems reluctant. These beings appear in moments of crisis or awakening, offering measures, names, and calendars, then slipping away as if their purpose was not to govern, but to witness something unfolding. It is possible that the earliest idea of God was not a claim about magic, but about difference, a way to describe those who were not like us, who did not share our frailty, who seemed to carry time within them. A traveler carries a map. And if these beings once existed, perhaps they were not the architects of the human story at all, but the last readers of a book that had already burned. Some interpretations suggest a civilization existed before the first human cities took shape, before the first clay tablets were pressed with marks, before the first graves were arranged with tenderness and fear. Not merely an earlier tribe or forgotten kingdom, but something older in a deeper sense, an order of life that rose, flourished, and then collapsed so completely that even its name was dissolved. We imagine history as a ladder with humanity climbing rung by rung, but the earth does not promise ladders. The earth is a place of cycles. Forests return, oceans advance and retreat. Mountains rise from the seabed and then we're down to dust. If a civilization before humanity once reached its height, it may have done so under skies that looked almost the same as ours. The same constellations, the same slow drift of stars, the same moon pulling at tides like a quiet heartbeat. Yet it might have been separated from us not by the distance of space, but by the abyss of time. Its remnants would not sit neatly in museums. They would be ground into sediment, scattered into the bones of future continents. Ancient sources describe great floods, skies of fire, long winters without end. They speak of ages when the world was rearranged, when coastlines vanished and new lands emerged. It is possible that these were not merely metaphors or local disasters, but distant echoes of a global collapse. If such a collapse occurred, it may not have left millions of survivors. It may have left only a handful. A small number of beings who carried the memory of what had been, like embers carried through darkness. In that view, the gods were not gods at all. They were survivors. Survivors are often misunderstood by those who come after. A single person who has lived through a fallen world can appear to those born later as someone from legend. Their knowledge becomes eerie, their composure unnatural, their habits and caution inexplicable. If the last remnants of an older civilization walked among early humans, they would have seemed impossibly strange. They would have known patterns the rest of humanity had not yet discovered. They would have carried skills, fragments of language, and a sense of scale that made the first human settlements look like children as shelters against a storm. Longevity alone can become a kind of divinity. To live longer than anyone else is to become a living contradiction. For early societies, where lives were shorter and the world was harsher, a being who seemed not to age, or who aged differently, would invite myth the way a wound invites a scar. Over time, observation could turn into reverence, and reverence into worship. The human mind fills gaps with symbols. It cannot easily endure the idea that someone might be superior in certain ways without being supernatural. So we turn them into something else. We place them above the world, so we do not have to measure ourselves against them. Some interpretations suggest that worship, at its beginning, is not devotion but misunderstanding. The first temples are built not for rulers, but for presences that could not be explained. A stranger's footprint becomes a sign. A lesson becomes a commandment, a warning becomes a prophecy. In time, the memory of survival is rewritten as the myth of creation. Why would such survivors watch humanity at all? If these beings were the last of their kind, then the world around them would have been both familiar and alien. Familiar in its sunrises and winds, alien in its emptiness. Imagine standing among ruins no one else can recognize as ruins. Imagine carrying a past that has no listeners. In such a silence, even the smallest new life would draw attention. Humans may have been a secondary species, emerging into the open spaces after the collapse, rising where old structures had fallen and ecosystems had shifted. The survivors might have seen in us not a rival, but a continuation, not heirs exactly, but witnesses to a new chapter. Ancient sources describe gods who look down from mountains, who walk along the edges of forests, who travel over waters, who appear at the borders of known lands. Their distance is constant, they are present, but not intimate. They seem to study rather than embrace. It is possible that what later generations called divine judgment was, in its original form, assessment. The watchers observed human development the way a botanist observes a seedling, with curiosity, with caution, and perhaps with an old sorrow. They would have studied our instincts, our violence and tenderness, our ability to cooperate and betray, our hunger for meaning. They might have watched our first rituals with a strange familiarity, recognizing in the circle around the fire an echo of their own lost gatherings. Perhaps they feared that the same pattern could repeat, that any civilization, no matter how brilliant, carries within it the seeds of collapse. And perhaps they wondered if humanity could grow differently, if it could learn without inheriting the mistakes of those who came before. Yet the Watchers, if they existed, were not rulers. Their goal, some interpretations suggest, was preservation, not domination. To preserve knowledge is to admit that knowledge can die. It is to accept that the world can forget. And in the early human world, knowledge was fragile. A single drought, a single conflict, a single season of hunger could end a tribe and erase a way of life. If the Watchers carried fragments of an older understanding, they may have chosen to seed them into human societies like hidden grains. Ancient sources describe gifts, agriculture revealed, the shaping of stone taught, the sky's patterns explained. Not delivered as a sudden miracle, but offered as instruction. A hand guiding another hand, a voice naming what the eye already sees. The Watchers occasionally intervened, not to build empires for humanity, but to help humanity survive its own beginnings. In this view, the first fields were not conjured by divine power, but by a careful nudge. The first monuments were not raised to glorify gods, but to anchor memory. Architecture becomes a way to hold time steady, to mark a place against the amnesia of generations. Astronomy becomes a way to measure the world, to predict seasons, to align life with the larger rhythms of the cosmos. These are not the tools of sorcery, they are the tools of continuity. And yet, even as they taught, the Watchers remained apart. They did not stay to govern. They did not occupy human cities as kings. They did not fill the world with their presence. Their interventions, if they occurred, were brief. As if they knew that too much guidance would deform what they meant to observe. There is a quiet cruelty in observation. To watch a species grow is to accept that it must make its own mistakes. The Watchers may have understood that if humanity relied on them, humanity would never become fully itself. And so withdrawal begins, not as abandonment, but as a deliberate fading. Ancient sources describe gods who depart. They retreat to high places, to distant islands, to deserts, to hidden valleys. Some disappear into the sea. Others ascend into the sky in language that could be metaphor, or could be the mind's attempt to describe an absence. The stories differ in detail, but they agree in mood. The departure is slow, and it is final. It is a world that learns, gradually, what it means to be alone. As humanity developed, the Watchers slowly disappeared. Some retreated to isolated regions where the world was quieter and human footsteps were rare. Others vanished entirely, leaving behind only traces in myth and symbol. It is possible that they died, One by one, the last candles of a former age extinguished without ceremony. It is possible that they chose distance for reasons we cannot easily imagine, to protect what remained of themselves, to prevent worship from becoming a chain, or to avoid repeating old patterns of power. With time, the transformation into myth was inevitable. Over generations, memory replaces reality. The nuance of observer is hard to preserve. The human mind prefers a simpler story. Gods must be creators, because creators are easier to worship than survivors. Teachers become rulers because rulers are easier to fear. A being who offered agriculture becomes the one who invented the earth itself. A watcher who studied the stars becomes the one who placed them in the sky. The ordinary distortions of storytelling are amplified by centuries until the original shape is lost. Some interpretations suggest that mythology is history seen through water. The outlines remain, but the details ripple. A council becomes a pantheon. A handful of survivors becomes a celestial family. Their arguments, their grief, their decisions are translated into battles of thunder and storms. What was once a cautious intervention becomes a saga of divine command. And still, even in the grandest myths, there are moments that feel strangely modest. Gods who teach crafts, gods who warn rather than punish, gods who mourn the world, gods who walk away. If these beings once existed, why does no direct evidence remain? Time is an eraser with infinite patience. Stone fractures, metal corrodes. Wood becomes soil, entire coastlines shift. Deserts cover cities, forests consume walls. Even without catastrophe, the earth reclaims. And if the watchers were few, their footprint would have been small. They would not have built sprawling capitals in an age when they were trying to remain unseen. They would have been careful. Survivors are rarely loud. Secrecy, too, can be a kind of survival. If the last of an older civilization wished to avoid being pursued, exploited, or turned into idols, they would have chosen isolation. They may have concealed their remaining refuges, leaving only symbols as markers. Not obvious monuments, but patterns that could be recognized only by those who knew what to look for. A geometry repeated in different lands, a story told in different tongues, a motif carved into stone that persists like a signature. Ancient sources describe signs rather than proofs, strange lights, impossible ages, voices from mountains, teachers who arrive without lineage. And then there are the unexplained structures that persist in human imagination, megaliths too heavy for easy explanation, alignments too precise to be accidental, ruins that seem older than their stories. It is possible that these are not evidence of a lost civilization before humanity, but they are the kinds of riddles that invite the mind to consider it. The world contains gaps. In those gaps, myths take root. Perhaps the absence of direct evidence is itself part of the story. If the Watchers existed and wished to withdraw, they might have ensured their traces would vanish. They might have dismantled what remained, hiding knowledge in forms that would look like religion rather than record. They might have chosen to leave humanity with only enough to begin, not enough to chase them. Eventually, humanity was left alone. The Watchers ceased observing, or they observed from a distance so vast it became indistinguishable from absence. Human societies expanded across continents. They built cities, then empires. They invented laws, then wars. They learned to write, then to forget what writing was meant to preserve. They raised temples to gods whose original faces were no longer remembered. And all the while, the idea of Watchers survived as a kind of shadow behind the gods, the sense that someone once saw humanity not as children of divinity, but as a young species worth studying. In this telling, humanity's loneliness is not a punishment. It is a condition of maturity. To be left alone is to be trusted with one's own future. It is to inherit the world not as a gift from rulers, but as a responsibility with no overseer. And yet, at the edge of the story, a quiet uncertainty remains. Perhaps the Watchers are gone, perhaps they died out long ago, their last breath unrecorded, their last memory dissolving into the air of some forgotten valley. Or perhaps observation never truly ended. Some interpretations suggest that the oldest myths speak not of gods who vanished, but of gods who hid. Not from fear, but from a desire to witness what humanity would become without interference. Ancient sources describe eyes in the sky, silent judges, distant presences that listen to prayers without answering. These may be poetic inventions, or they may be distorted recollections of something more restrained, watchers who refuse to be worshipped, observers who do not want to be found. If these beings once existed, they might not be waiting to return as rulers. They might be waiting for something else entirely. For humanity to reach a certain threshold of understanding. For humanity to prove it can carry knowledge without turning it into a weapon. For humanity to become, in its own right, a civilization that will not collapse into the same old ruin. It is possible that the true question is not whether they were gods, or even whether they existed. The question is what the idea reveals about us. That we sense, deep down, that we have been seen before. That we are not merely lonely creatures shouting into the dark, but beings whose early steps may have been witnessed by eyes older than our stories. And if we were watched once, then the most haunting thought is not that someone might still be there, hidden in the quiet places of the world, listening to the rise and fall of our voices. The most haunting thought is what those watchers might have felt as they observed us, not reverence, not hatred, but recognition. The sorrow of survivors, the patience of those who have already lost everything once. Because in the end, the question is not who they were, but what they saw in us.